Bonsoir, Madame et Monsieur. Good evening, dear guests, dear friends. We are very happy to see all of you with us today at Apéro Géopolitique, independent discussion platform, which we created with the Swiss UMEF University of Applied Institute to discuss the most acute, the most actual geopolitical topics. The topic of today's discussion is Venezuela, Greenland, Iran, a new world war or the energy and resources. It looks like a new Cold War is not about ideology, democracy against autocracy. It's about control of the energy and resources. So the main players are the USA, Russia, and China, and it's about the control on supply chains, resources, tax supremacy. I will not go long explaining the topic. I'm happy to introduce our experts. Ambassador Branson McKinley, State Department diplomat, former ambassador in Haiti and many countries. He was 10 years Director General of the International Organization for Migration at UN. Christopher Alexander Payard. He's a French geopolitical strategist and senior civil servant, recognized for his sharp analysis of global power shifts and strategic resources. His background is very impressive, and it's too long to list all his positions. I will just tell that he was a director of strategic affairs at the French Minister of Defense, and also a deputy director of European Armament Cooperation Organization in Germany, the most recently. He also was an expert on energy issues at NATO and European Commission. Hicham Lehmissi, a geopolitical analyst and lecturer at Swiss UMEF University. Hicham Lehmissi is a regular columnist in different international media, and he is author of Apéro Géopolitique, which he launched in Annemasse, and together we are organizing it in Geneva. So I would like to emphasize that we are here not to criticize any government. We are here to understand what is going on. And so myself is Cathy Kajoari. I have been working in journalism over 20 years, and I'm also a book author, Building Peace, Moldova, Switzerland. So our discussion will last 1 hour and then 30 minutes for your questions. And I kindly ask our experts to keep answers 5-7 minutes per question. So I would like to start with Ambassador Branson McKinley. Today when we read news, it's sometimes more, how to say, shocking than Netflix. Some people stopped looking Netflix, they were watching Trump's actions. So if you can comment on recent events in Venezuela, which is not really much discussed, on Greenland and current tension between Iran and the USA. So looking at all these situations, can we tell we are still in geopolitics, or we are entering in a sort of chaos where resources replace the law, and power is replacing legitimacy? So, can we still talking about international law? And please put the big accent on Venezuela, glory operation.
Thank you very much, Cathy. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. Your question is a broad one, a good one, and I'll try to come to grips with it. Let me start with the four main axes, four main directions or objectives of Mr. Trump's foreign policy. These are his geopolitical objectives. And those who have come to other sessions know this already, but they are dominance of the Western Hemisphere, a deal with Russia, kind of rapprochement with Russia, containment of China, an effort to slow the growth of China, America's major rival, And finally, fourth, peace and stability in the Middle East, just primarily to get it off the table. So those are the four geopolitical axes of Trump. He has some other things in mind: institutional reform, UN, NATO, change or replace, and as a general proposition, of course, he wants to keep the United States number one. That's what MAGA means in foreign policy terms. But you need to keep all of this in mind when you come to discuss the particular events and episodes that occupy the front pages today. Let me say a word about energy, because energy is a factor in all four of the areas, and an important one in most of them. If there are four geopolitical goals, then there are three kinds of energy. The traditional ones, fossil fuels and nuclear fission, the ones that have been around a while. Then there are the renewables, solar and wind power. And finally, there's the new futuristic forms of energy, nuclear fusion, hydrogen energy, and applications for space and the moon and beyond. So going through that list of the three kinds, it's pretty easy to see that Mr. Trump likes traditional forms of energy. Indeed, he wants to be the leading player in fossil fuels, and that's one of the reasons he wants to pair up with Russia, so that Russia and the United States together can have a dominant position in fossil fuels. He doesn't like renewables at all. He thinks renewables are a scam, something his political opponents invented, and, moreover, an area where China has a very big lead, which it is not in the interest of the United States to increase. So yes to fossil fuels, no to renewables. And as for the new technologies, fusion and space, well, he's certainly going to do everything he can to put America in the lead on those, but that's a little bit science fiction for the present. But keep your eye on it, because it will come probably faster than any of us think. So that, by way of general background, the four goals and the three forms of energy. You certainly see it in Venezuela. That's taking control of the hemisphere, taking control of the fossil fuel resources of the hemisphere, so that you can squeeze Cuba, that thorn in the side of every American president since Dwight Eisenhower, and that's happening. And particularly so that you can regulate the supply of America's fossil fuels to China and other potential customers. And by regulate, I mean slow down. So it's a measure also against China, as you see. I mean, they're rounding up tankers in the dark fleet all around the world, and that will continue. Greenland has fossil fuels. Their exploitation is a long way in the future, but we're talking about things that have a long timeline. And if you could move into Greenland, extract and refine also fossil fuels there, then the new fleet of icebreakers that Trump will want to, for his Arctic strategy, will have a convenient place to refuel. This is an old theme, but Greenland will serve that aspect as well. Iran, well, I hardly need mention, Iran is a big fossil fuel producer. Trump would like to see the regime change there, but he may not be able to help bring that about. But he is in a position to put the squeeze on Iran as well and interfere with the shipment of Iranian oil to China. So you see all of these things do tend to fit together. I think perhaps, Kati, that's enough for now.
No, I ask you about international law and how would you comment Venezuela from this point? Kidnapping Maduro, how would you
Well, how does international law apply to all of this? Up-end, I don't see it. This is another whole subject, of course. We get into it a little bit from time to time at Apéro Géopolitique, but I'm an international law skeptic, and I say, along with many others, that to call it law is a misnomer, because if you call it law, in your mind, you think of something which can be enforced by some authority in a position to enforce it. But there is no international authority which can enforce penalties against infractions. So what you have instead of international law is you have international conventional arrangements made by nation states because they find them to be in their own interests, but which they only abide by so long as they continue to think that it is in their interest to do so. And this applies particularly to the great powers, and you could go through the list of all of them, present and throughout history, who have paid very little attention to the conventions, written or unwritten, over many centuries. So I do think, and this of course is heresy here in Geneva, one of the world capitals of international law, but I do think people confuse themselves when they talk about international law. And it's even worse in French, because the word droit, it means law, but it also means right. And people have rights, but does that mean those rights have the force of law? Well, it's the same word in French, so yes, they must be enforceable. They must be, but they aren't. So I think you will see Mr. Trump go about his business as he conceives it to be in the interest of the United States, without much of a regard for the legal niceties. That's my view anyway.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, Ambassador Branston McKinley is a skeptic, international law skeptic. What about you? Do you believe that international law still exists, or we are coming in the era of law of strongest? And do you think that big superpowers, USA, China, and Russia, in this energy competition can escalate to a direct military conflict?
I think I'm much more skeptical. So I'm sorry, I'm in Geneva. Well, first, thank you for inviting me, and I would like to say that I'm not talking on behalf of the French government. So this evening I'm a civil servant, but I'm talking freely with, the invitation of Mr. Ambassador. So I'm not talking, I don't have any formal or official position this evening. So what I'm going to say, it's just something for free. And my experience of about 30 years in the French public service. And for many, many years, I was also an academic in Paris and in different places. I gave conferences in Washington, in London, for example, the Royal Institute of International Affairs. And I remembered a lecture I gave on international law, something I learned from my own studies in Paris and in Oxford, where I spent a year. And that was something from the Permanent Court of International Justice. So that's the only thing I'm going to quote this evening, which was the Lotus case, which was France versus Turkey in 1927. So I'm just going to read the definition of international law, which was given at the time by the Permanent Court of International Justice. So I'm opening the brackets. International law governs relations between independent states. The rules of law binding states therefore stem from the will of those states as expressed in conventions or customs generally accepted as an enshrining principle of law and established with a view to regulating the coexistence of these independent communities or pursuing common goals. Limitation on the independence of states cannot therefore be presumed. So, in the fields of energy, minerals, and raw materials as a whole, there is nothing which could be called a regulation based on international law regarding, in fact, energy and all the topics that we are talking about this evening, not only in Venezuela or in Iran or in Russia or in the European Union. But in a way or another, it's the story of the world. You probably know the Bronze Age, you know the Copper Age, the Iron Age, and we are in very low in the Maslow pyramid. And after the Second World War, and we are in Geneva, a lot of people, especially in Europe, and maybe only in Europe, thought that the world could be regulated by international law and a new world. So I don't think we are back to the age of the empires, as I read in different magazines or papers, because they never disappeared, in fact. The only thing was that a lot of Europeans thought they were disappearing. So in a way or another, when I gave lectures at the Paris Sciences Po or at the National School of Administration, and I had a course in international relations for 20 years at the Paris Sciences Po, I always told my students that international law is only a tool, in fact, to regulate the relationship, which was the definition given in the case in the Permanent Court of International Justice, between states. So we have the Geneva Convention, we have the Société des Nations, you know, all the buildings here in Geneva, and we have the United Nations. It doesn't mean, in my opinion, that all these things do not have, you know, something useful in the world we know. But for a long time, and I think it's going to last, the relationship between states is based on force, even if it's a form of soft power. For many years, I was in a think tank in Britain, which is called the Ditchley Park Foundation, and that's how I met Robert Nye, who died recently, you know, who for a long time wrote books, gave lectures, and especially on the concept of soft power. So a soft power is also a power and is force, you know, in a way or another. When, for example, you watch Netflix, and you have some American programs and an American way of seeing things, it's a way of imposing you a model, a cultural model. And that's something which was of a real importance for General de Gaulle, who for a long time defended France and its independence. And I'm going to give you one piece of advice. There's a very good book which was published in France a few years ago by an historian called Éric Brancat, about the French-American relationship between 1940 and 1970, in fact, and the fact that, for example, Roosevelt tried for many years to block General de Gaulle. He hated General de Gaulle, and that's the reason why General de Gaulle, when he came back to power in 1958, in fact, tried everything to give back the independence to my country. On the field of energy and raw materials, which is the topic of this evening, what we are seeing in Venezuela or in Greenland are not, I think, the main parts of the story. Because to have energy in Venezuela is something complicated because, as you know, it's heavy oil. And in the Orinoco area, in fact, it's going to cost an awful lot of money to implement the production and to restore PDVSA, which is the main company, even if you are some foreign companies which are in fact probably going to enter the market in Venezuela in the next years, probably. But when I look at Iraq, I remember 23 years ago, I was working with my American colleagues before the war. And we had a meeting in Texas in April 2003 with the State Department, the Pentagon, and the main oil and gas companies coming from the United States, but also from Britain. And there was a deputy chairman, for example, from BP. And in fact, all these guys were opposing the action of the British and the Americans in Iraq. I remember it very well because when I came back to Paris, just before 1 month before the start of the war, nobody could believe me, in fact, because everyone in Europe was convinced that the Americans and the British were going to Iraq because of oil and gas. But that was not true. And when you look at what's happening 23 years afterwards, in fact, that's true. In fact, that was the last thing to do, in fact, to invade the country. And it's about the same story about Venezuela, in fact. And we don't really need, in fact, the oil of the country. It's a little bit different in the case of raw materials and minerals. I'm just going to stay in Europe because I had a discussion last week with my colleagues in Paris, and especially 3 weeks ago with the chief of staff of the French Navy, which is who is a former colleague of mine, and we were in fact discussing about what we are discussing tonight, about the minerals, oil and gas, Iran, Venezuela, and what's the purpose of the French Navy, for example, in the global landscape. In fact, in 2008, the European Commissioner, Verheugen, decided to launch a plan for the European Union and all the European Union's member states to support a policy in favor of some sort of common policy on strategic minerals, not only for the energy transition, but also because we strongly need it and more for our industry. For the time being, I work not too far. I'm based in Annecy for the French government. And where I worked is in fact one of the strongest places in France for the industry. And many small and medium-sized companies in Haute-Savoie and Savoie, so not far, are working in the field of defense and key strategic industries. And all these industries, especially in what we call la vallée de l'Arve, in fact, are using a lot of metals or alloys. And one of our main problems, which has been debated, by the way, again recently in Brussels and in Anvers, you certainly saw that a few days ago there was a European meeting in Anvers. We have some minerals in Europe. We need it for energy transition and for all our industries. But if I take the example of scandium, because I had a question from my colleagues from Brussels about scandium. In fact, scandium is one of the rare earth metals, in fact. You've got 17 metals, and among these 17 metals, you've got scandium. And it's used with aluminium, in fact, to make alloys, which are used in the aircraft industry. And one of the main problems of the Europeans for the time being, regarding or considering the situation in China and in the United States or in Russia, is the fact that we didn't open mines at all in the last 30 years. In France, in Germany, in Italy, in Spain. We have resources. I take the example again of scandium, we have the possibility of opening mines in Sweden. But nobody in Europe is really willing to do the job. And it's one of our main problems. That's the reason why we are a little bit weak for the time being in this very specific field, because there is no European policy regarding raw materials or strategic minerals. We are not even able to support the energy transition we are in fact we have been implementing for many, many years, destroying, by the way, our own car industry, especially in France, but not only in France, by stupid policies. And now we are trying to reverse. There was a decision last December of the European Commission, which was obliged, in fact, to change the position of European states regarding the electrification of the car industry and all the vehicles in Europe, because Germany and Italy realized that, in fact, we were on the verge of completely destroying the European industry. And it's almost done in France, by the way. So, yes, I'll come back to it afterwards, yes. And so I'm going to stop because my time, I think, is...
I ask you if in future, 21st century, we can imagine that the energy competition between USA, China and Russia can lead to a direct military conflict or not? How do you see it?
It's difficult to say. I don't think we fight for energy, by the way. We fight for something else. We fight for culture, we fight for political reasons, we fight for ego, which is the main leader of the world, by the way. But we barely fight for energy. I don't believe in it.
So why Trump's operation kidnapping Maduro happened? Why they need control on Venezuela, if not for oil?
I've been working in Latin America for many years. When I was the deputy director in the Strategic Affairs Directorate of the French Ministry of Defense, I was specifically in charge of Latin America. And I was supporting the export of armaments towards 5 countries, which have got a strategic alliance with France. What I'm saying is official, it's not a secret. Which are Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Peru, and Mexico. And we also work, by the way, on raw materials and strategic minerals, because in fact, Latin America is full of strategic minerals. And I think, in my opinion, Donald Trump went to Venezuela for different reasons, but certainly not for energy. He said he was going there for oil, but I don't think it's really the situation. It's not exactly the truth, in fact. He's trying first, in my opinion, to finish the job, because I worked with the Bush administration, Bush Jr., before, during, and after the war in Iraq. And I met, for example, the special advisor of George Bush for the Middle East. And I don't think that they went there for oil. They went there for ego. And because he wanted to finish the job his father didn't finish in 1991. And it's about the same story, in fact. Donald Trump is trying to mark history. And he's, in fact, he wants, and that's, I'm sure, that's what he is doing, that he wants to reverse the tide in Latin America about Cuba and Venezuela, and to do that, what you said, in fact, a few minutes ago, that what a lot of presidents in the United States were not able to do for about 60, 70 years, in fact, well, especially in the case of Cuba. And so that's the same story in the case of Venezuela. It doesn't mean that there is no background on oil and raw materials and minerals, but I don't think it's the main reason. And that's a strong opinion I have on the topics.
What do you think about Venezuela case? It's about energy or it's about American imperialism? So I would like to ask you point by point to go to Venezuela, Greenland and Iran to give you a short analysis to each case and your scenarios forecasts.
Ok. Bon. Merci. Tout d'abord, bonsoir à tous. Bienvenue dans cette enceinte de la Suisse UMEF, qui est une université privée, spécialisée notamment dans les relations internationales, mais également dans d'autres disciplines. Alors pour répondre à la question de Cathy, justement sur ce rapport aux ressources Alors guerre pour les ressources ou non. Alors moi j'aimerais dire que toutes les guerres sont liées d'une façon ou d'une autre aux questions de ressources, et c'est une problématique, j'allais dire, anthropologique qui existe depuis les origines même de l'humanité. Lorsqu'on regarde les premiers conflits qui ont existé entre les populations dites nomades qui vivaient très souvent entre guillemets de la rapine ou bien de l'attaque des greniers des populations sédentaires, on était déjà dans cette logique de captation des ressources. Si on regarde les conflits aujourd'hui qui opposent les grandes puissances, alors évidemment il y a une dimension idéologique, il y a une dimension fondamentalement politique, il y a une question psychologique liée à l'ego des dirigeants, ça je partage tout à fait votre vision, et c'est extrêmement intéressant de voir qu'un certain nombre de conflits peuvent être motivés par ce genre de situation. Alors vous parliez de l'Irak, je partage ce point de vue, à ceci près qu'il y a aussi des lobbies militaristes, hein. Toute l'industrie, tout ce qu'on appelle le complexe militaro-industriel américain avait besoin de se construire un ennemi, notamment au lendemain de la guerre froide, et cet ennemi il a été créé notamment autour d'une certaine image d'un danger qui venait du Moyen-Orient, et dans un contexte quand même assez particulier lié aux attentats du 11 septembre 2001, on a eu concomitamment la guerre en Afghanistan, la guerre en Irak, qui a aussi justifié économiquement un certain nombre de dépenses militaires, dépenses qui se chiffrent en milliers de milliards de dollars. Et ça, c'est quelque chose qui joue, alors pas forcément directement dans la recherche de ressources, la captation de ressources, mais de façon indirecte pour justifier en fait des investissements, des dépenses d'armement importantes. Et en ce sens, il y a quand même une dimension économique, outre le fait qu'on a une dimension idéologique liée aussi à certains lobbies liés aux intérêts d'Israël, au Moyen-Orient, et en même temps une certaine vision du monde, clash des civilisations, donc c'était une idée qui était très à la mode à cette époque. Mais ceci dit, cela ne nous empêche pas de voir aujourd'hui, en tout cas de mon point de vue, qu'on a quand même une dérive, en tout cas une tendance, vers des conflits qui sont de plus en plus marqués par le marqueur en fait économique, le marqueur de la course aux richesses, aux ressources naturelles, énergétiques, mais également les terres rares qui jouent un rôle très important parce qu'en réalité elles sont de plus en plus stratégiques. C'est-à-dire qu'aujourd'hui, pour contrôler le chemin de ce qu'on appelle la transition économique, c'est-à-dire le passage des économies dites traditionnelles aux économies dites entre guillemets vertes de transition, qui s'inscrivent dans des nouveaux paradigmes dans le rapport à l'énergie, bien, il faut avoir accès à des ressources particulières. Ces ressources, c'est ce qu'on appelle les terres rares, donc qui sont des terres aujourd'hui qui sont principalement dans la chaîne de valeur contrôlées par une grande puissance qui est la Chine. Et on voit bien que la montée des tensions aujourd'hui et le discours, par exemple, qui est celui de l'administration Trump dans sa politique étrangère et dans l'éclosion d'un certain nombre de conflits est fortement lié à cette idée que les États-Unis, en fait, veulent de leur côté pouvoir accéder et sécuriser, en fait, leur accès à des terres rares qui seraient des terres rares alternatives à celles aujourd'hui contrôlées par la Chine. Et il faut prendre en considération un autre élément, c'est que cette réflexion ne s'inscrit pas simplement dans l'accès aux ressources, mais c'est aussi la création de la chaîne de valeur, tout le raffinage qui va avec et qui va demander des investissements très lourds et assez importants. Concernant le Venezuela, alors évidemment il y a une dimension qui est liée peut-être à la reconfiguration des grands équilibres et aux discussions qui ont dû se dérouler durant ces derniers mois entre les parties américaines et notamment russes, avec l'idée que peut-être l'Amérique du Sud rentrait dans une sphère américaine qui était communément admise par les autres grandes puissances et que les États-Unis aujourd'hui seraient dans une logique qui serait de vouloir reprendre le contrôle, reprendre la main sur un certain nombre de pays, de puissances sud-américaines qui s'étaient, comment dirais-je, un peu trop autonomisés par rapport aux intérêts américains, et notamment tous les États sud-américains qui sont liés en fait à l'éclosion de ce qu'ont été les mouvements de la gauche latino-américaine. On pense au Venezuela de Chavez, on peut repenser à la Bolivie. Alors le Brésil, c'est encore un cas à part, et on peut penser évidemment à Cuba, hein, qui est sous sanction depuis 1962 avec une espèce d'embargo qui n'en finit pas, et donc peut-être qu'aujourd'hui nous serions un peu dans une logique où les États-Unis voudraient reprendre la main sur cette sphère qu'elle considère être la sienne, hein, notamment à travers ce qu'on avait appelé la fameuse doctrine Monroe, rebaptisée doctrine Donroe, en référence à Donald Trump. Mais il y a également une dimension économique qui est très importante, c'est-à-dire qu'aujourd'hui, si on prend le cas des États-Unis, on peut faire une analyse en disant que les États-Unis n'ont pas besoin en fait du pétrole du Moyen-Orient, n'ont pas besoin du pétrole de Venezuela. Bon, c'est discutable. Pourquoi ? Parce que les réserves pétrolières américaines, elles sont surtout portées par ce qu'on appelle le pétrole de schiste, pétrole non conventionnel, pareil pour le gaz. Et si les États-Unis aujourd'hui sont le premier producteur de pétrole et de gaz au monde, pétrole et gaz non conventionnels, en termes de réserves, c'est très différent. Les réserves sont beaucoup plus limitées, d'autant plus que c'est un pays qui consomme en fait énormément d'énergie carbonée. Mais ce qu'il faut regarder aussi, c'est qu'il y a un autre élément. C'est que le grand concurrent des États-Unis, c'est la Chine. Et la Chine, c'est un pays, alors certes, qui a une domination sur la chaîne de valeur liée aux terres rares, qui aujourd'hui de plus en plus a une domination technologique dans une série de domaines, et on l'a vu il y a 2 jours à travers la performance absolument exceptionnelle, vous savez, de ces fameux robots qui ont marqué le début de la nouvelle année chinoise, et qui ont montré que la Chine avait une avance technologique qui est très importante dans un certain nombre de domaines que l'on refuse de voir, dans une sorte de déni, malheureusement. La Chine, elle a besoin d'énergie, elle a besoin d'accès aux ressources, elle a besoin du pétrole iranien, elle a besoin du pétrole vénézuélien. Et que quelque part, en fait, par un espèce d'effet domino, si aujourd'hui les Américains se sont engagés dans cette politique de domination, cette politique de conquête à l'égard du Venezuela, en violant systématiquement le droit international, sur le questionnement qui était posé tout à l'heure, je pense qu'il n'y a pas de débat en la matière, eh bien c'est surtout pour empêcher les Chinois de pouvoir accéder facilement à des réserves, à des ressources énergétiques, pétrole, gaz, dont elle a absolument besoin. Et on peut lire également ce qui se déroule aujourd'hui dans la crise qui oppose les États-Unis à l'Iran, outre le jeu des lobbies israéliens, qu'il ne faut pas enlever d'un revers de la main, parce que c'est un enjeu qui est très important. S'il n'y avait pas les pressions, il n'y avait pas les lobbies israéliens, je ne pense pas qu'aujourd'hui les États-Unis seraient en train de s'apprêter à bombarder à leur risque et dépens militaires l'Iran. Voilà, en tout cas, c'est mon point de vue sur la question. Mais sur la question de l'Iran, on est dans la même situation, parce qu'aujourd'hui, le seul pays qui est en réalité en capacité de dépasser un petit peu d'outrepasser les sanctions et d'acheter le pétrole iranien, c'est la Chine. La Chine, aujourd'hui, est totalement dépendante du pétrole du Moyen-Orient, Iran, Arabie Saoudite tout particulièrement, Russie également. Et donc, moi, je lirais les choses dans une lecture économique qui serait plus située dans une politique de containment énergétique de la Chine. D'autant plus que sur la question, par exemple, iranienne, il faut prendre en considération d'autres éléments, c'est que l'Iran se situe au cœur d'un certain nombre de grands projets structurants mondiaux, les nouvelles routes de la soie, dans lesquelles l'Iran joue un rôle très important dans la connexion entre la Chine et le port de Bandar Abbas qui donne sur l'océan Indien. On a également un nouveau corridor stratégique qui est en train de se constituer entre la Russie, qui relierait alors la mer Baltique, passant par donc traversant tout le territoire russe par voie fluviale jusqu'à la mer Caspienne, et de la mer Caspienne jusqu'à l'océan Indien par des canaux, des différentes liaisons qui sont en train d'être mises en place aujourd'hui. Et l'Iran est aussi au passage d'une autre grande route énergétique qui passe par la Caspienne, la transcaspienne, et qui met en relation en fait l'Asie centrale, le Caucase, le Moyen-Orient et les marchés européens. Et donc ça, c'est aussi un élément à prendre en considération qui fait que l'Iran en fait joue un rôle extrêmement important dans toutes ces architectures, d'autant que l'Iran a rejoint les BRICS, fait partie désormais aussi de l'OCTS, l'Organisation de coopération du traité de Shanghai, et tous ces éléments font que l'Iran dispose d'une place géopolitique et géostratégique très importante, qui a d'ailleurs été parfaitement théorisée à l'époque par Brzezinski, qui présentait justement l'Iran comme un pays pivot à l'égal de l'Ukraine, par exemple, et que c'était un pays dont le contrôle était un enjeu extrêmement important pour la domination américaine en fait sur la région et plus globalement sur le monde. Et donc pour répondre aux questions, quel est le point commun un petit peu entre toutes ces crises, Venezuela, Groenland, Iran, je considère oui de plus en plus la question des ressources. C'est une question qui est vitale. La question des ressources au sens large, si on prend par exemple le cas du Groenland, il y a une dimension qui est liée à l'accès à des ressources hydrocarbures non encore prouvées mais qui seraient importantes, notamment en pétrole et en gaz. On a différentes estimations, notamment d'une organisation américaine, c'est la Geological Survey, je crois que c'est ça, organisation, c'est ça, qui dit, en gros, vous me corrigerez si je me trompe sur les chiffres, que 30% des réserves de gaz non prouvées, ou en tout cas non encore exploitables, se situeraient au niveau du Groenland, et 13% des réserves de pétrole. Donc ça veut dire que le Groenland est assis quand même sur un trésor qui est certain, outre également la présence de différents matériaux stratégiques, cuivre, nickel, uranium, cobalt, très important dans la fameuse révolution de la transition énergétique dont on parle beaucoup. Et on a également alors, des réserves très importantes au niveau du plateau continental groenlandais et qui expliquerait pourquoi les États-Unis essayeraient de tirer leur épingle du jeu. En ce sens, le Groenland, c'est un territoire qui a un statut particulier parce qu'on dit très souvent que le Groenland c'est l'Union européenne, le Groenland c'est le Danemark, c'est pas vrai du tout. Le Groenland c'est un territoire autonome qui est destiné à devenir indépendant, ce qui ne veut pas dire que les États-Unis sont en droit de récupérer le Groenland, mais les États-Unis étant une fédération composée de 50 États, qu'est-ce qui l'empêcherait de vouloir proposer au Groenland de rejoindre la fédération des États-Unis et de constituer un nouvel État, ce qui permettrait, et là je vous rejoindrai encore au niveau de l'ego, bien de dire à Trump qu'il va marquer l'histoire américaine en permettant d'agrandir le territoire américain de 2,1 millions de kilomètres carrés, ce qui n'est pas rien, c'est en gros 1/5 du territoire américain en termes de superficie. Et qui plus est, un territoire sans migrants, et plein de richesses naturelles, et puis qui offre également une position très importante dans le grand jeu qui est en train de se jouer aujourd'hui, qui est celui des routes du Nord, qui sont des routes potentiellement concurrentes, des routes commerciales actuelles, et qui permettraient de relier en un temps plus court l'Asie de l'Est et l'Europe. Et ce point-là est également à prendre en considération. Donc je ne sais pas si j'ai répondu à peu près toutes les questions.
Iran, negotiations between the United States and Iran just yesterday, I think yesterday or today, in Geneva. So do you think they will come to a sort of compromise? Is Iran ready to a compromise, or what we can expect from the American side?
D'accord. Alors, concernant l'Iran, je ne suis pas la meilleure personne pour y répondre ici. Je ferai insulte à la délégation omanaise ici présente, dont je sais qu'elle a participé activement aux négociations et aux discussions d'hier, ici même à Genève, qui doit en savoir un peu plus que moi. Alors, je ne sais pas s'il faut attendre un sourire ou autre pour savoir si c'est positif ou pas. Tout ce que je peux dire, en tout cas moi de mon point de vue, de mon analyse, c'est qu'aujourd'hui les États-Unis, l'administration Trump s'est mise en fait dans une situation de dilemme très problématique, en ce sens où Trump est allé beaucoup trop loin dans la démonstration de force vis-à-vis de l'Iran, et un retrait sans un accord qui soit un accord favorable aux États-Unis en termes économiques et en termes sécuritaires pourrait passer au niveau de son opinion publique comme une sorte de faiblesse ou de reconnaissance de la puissance réelle de l'Iran, parce qu'il ne faut pas sous-estimer les Iraniens sur ce point de vue-là. Après, il y a un autre élément à prendre en considération. Rien ne nous dit qu'aujourd'hui, au niveau du leadership iranien, la solution d'une guerre ou d'une confrontation, c'est peut-être la même solution, c'est peut-être la meilleure solution pour assurer la survie du régime, parce que le régime a été particulièrement affaibli par les sanctions américaines et occidentales sur ces dernières années, et puis il y a une contestation en interne qui est réelle, qui est très importante, et qui fait que, j'allais dire que tous les scénarios, entre guillemets, sont ouverts. Moi, pour ma part, je pense qu'il y a une place importante qui pourrait être laissée à une situation en fait de négociation qui aboutisse à une sorte d'accord entre les États-Unis et l'Iran sur la base de compromis économiques importants, c'est-à-dire des commandes importantes dans l'aviation, l'achat de Boeing, des concessions sur les sites pétroliers et gaziers iraniens, et puis un accord à minima sur la question du nucléaire militaire, donc ce qui serait la meilleure solution et qui permettrait à toutes les parties de sauver la face. Puis après, l'autre scénario, c'est celui de l'affrontement. Et là, il est difficile de donner en réalité ou de proposer un scénario, en ce sens où on tend à lire la situation dans la relation avec l'Iran d'une façon qui est beaucoup trop marquée sur ce que disent les grands médias, c'est-à-dire à peu près tout et n'importe quoi. Donc les États-Unis sont super forts, l'Iran sont super faibles, ce qui n'est pas la réalité du terrain. Si on fait l'analyse de ce qui s'est déroulé dans la confrontation entre l'Iran et Israël en juin de l'année dernière, la fameuse guerre des 12 jours, on a pu constater la supériorité technologique balistique de l'Iran qui, de mon point de vue, est absolument incontestable. Et si ce n'était l'engagement américain, les choses auraient pu aller dans un sens du pire, l'effondrement pour Israël, voire l'utilisation de l'arme nucléaire par Israël contre l'Iran. Donc voilà un peu ce que je pourrais dire sur ces questions.
Merci beaucoup, Hichem.
My question to Ambassador Branson McKinley regarding Greenland. We already discussed this topic last conference. So slowly, Trump is achieving its goal. Do you think the United States will annex Greenland or buy Greenland? So what would be the future steps? Could be the future steps? And do you think Greenland can, how to say, accelerate, let's say, Cold War between China and USA?
Greenland, I don't know for sure how that's going to come out. If you look at it from President Trump's point of view, he wants to be able to take control of that territory for the reasons already mentioned tonight, reinforcing his interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine, that some people call the Don Roe Doctrine, and which he takes very seriously, and I would say correctly so, as a strategic thinker, as a geopolitician. It is very important to have the securest possible base of operation or sphere of influence or hegemony that one can acquire. And for the United States, a look at the globe tells you immediately what that base is. It is the Western Hemisphere. It's North America, Central America, and South America. That's the territory that Donald Trump, geopolitician, believes he must be in a position to control. Now, how will he end up controlling Greenland? There are different scenarios. At Davos, as you know, there was a big to-do about Greenland, and President Trump went away from Davos claiming that, you know, behind the scenes, he had already cut a kind of a deal which would satisfy all parties. And people speculated that it might be the Cyprus deal, because it is a fact that the United Kingdom has on Cyprus, and has had for a long time, a very large area over which it maintains complete control for the purposes of operating military bases. And such an agreement with Denmark might do what Trump feels he has to do. This is just speculation on my part. I don't really know how it will come out. But bear in mind, I said right at the beginning, Trump's first geopolitical goal is domination of the Western Hemisphere. And that's where Greenland comes in, that's where Venezuela comes in, that's where Cuba comes in, and that's where Brazil comes in too. All of these countries will be compelled to submit to the American lead. That's a very important, almost a principle of U.S. foreign policy. It was in fact enunciated over 200 years ago by the fifth American president, James Monroe, who at the time was not worried about China coming in, not worried about Russia coming in, but he was worried about Spain, France, and Great Britain. And he wanted to tell them, if you come in, we will oppose you. And that has been a constant position. So remember the Monroe Doctrine and its current corollary, the Monroe Doctrine. And if you think this is bizarre, contemplate another example, the Chinese example. Because, in fact, China has always operated very much the same kind of sphere of influence, hegemonic strategy over East Asia. Now, admittedly, there was a period of over 100, almost 200 years in which China was battered by the European and North American powers and had to give up any pretense of being the hegemon in East Asia. But if you look to the 2.5 millennia before then, that's exactly what the Han Dynasty and the Ming Dynasty and the Song Dynasty and even the early Qing Dynasty wanted to do. They wanted to be the hegemon, and they succeeded in being the hegemon. And nobody in the neighborhood of China got away with opposing the Chinese, and all of the neighboring states of China came regularly to pay tribute to the Son of Heaven. This is the Chinese strategy of regional hegemony, which James Monroe seems to have thought to be a good idea and picked it up for America. This is another debate, but when you think of why Trump is making a fuss about Greenland, yes, it's because of the Arctic lines of communication. Yes, it's because of defense against intercontinental ballistic military threats. Yes, it's about rare earth and petroleum. But it is, I think, perhaps first and foremost, about asserting America's predominance in the Western Hemisphere, which is the basis for everything else.
Before talking about Europe, I would like to come back to just a few things which have been quoted by Mr. Ambassador and by our friend. First, about Latin America and Venezuela. If you remember, the Monroe Doctrine was made in 1823. And the last country which got independence at the time was Brazil in 1822. And as you said, the problem of the United States at the time was first to keep its independence from Britain, because the country was attacked by Britain in 1812, and the Spaniards and the French were still around. And by the way, when there was the Civil War in the US, the French and the Spaniards went to Mexico to settle an empire and to destroy the Republic. So the Monroe Doctrine is not only something which has been made in Washington for simply, I would say, the pleasure of the Americans, but because at the time the Americans had the impression that they could be invaded again by European powers. And if you look at the situation nowadays in Latin America, because we are talking a lot about Donald Trump and the American way of seeing things, or what we think the American way is. If you look at the recent years, and we had many general elections in Latin America, and in fact, in all the countries in the last year, the left lost all the elections in Argentina, in Chile, in Bolivia, in Paraguay, in Peru, in Costa Rica, in Honduras, and it's going on. The next general elections are in Brazil next October, which is going to be a key phenomenon because in the last polls, the right is leading. And a lot of leaders I know in Latin America and friends of mine in the country, in Brazil and also in Chile and Argentina, are telling me that they are fed up of the left-wing policies, which are a failure in the whole continent, and the fact that the Chinese took the place of the Europeans in Latin America, exploiting Peru and Brazil and many countries, and especially Chile, for their minerals and, in fact, the richness of Latin America. Because we've been talking a lot about these metals. And by the way, the rare earth metals are metals. They're not earth, in fact. And we are not only talking about these specific metals, but all of the metals which are in the Mendeleev classification, the board of elements. And I talk about scandium, which is a rare earth metal, but in fact, the main richness for the next 50 years are not in China or in Greenland, they are in Latin America, in fact. If you took the example of uranium, which is not a rare earth metal, it's a metal which is only exploited in Chile, and it's used by General Electric, Pratt & Whitney, and Rolls-Royce for engines, military and civil aircraft. It's not used by Safran in France because we are not using uranium, in fact, for the engine M88, for example, of the Rafale. But in fact, the Chinese understood, and so the Americans, that for the next 50 years, things are going to be in Latin America. Not only, by the way, metals, but also oil and gas. I don't believe in the figures about the reserves in Greenland. That's not true. But that's something which is said in the press and in magazines. I think it's the figures are not true because, in fact, when you start talking about reserves, there's a lot of problems behind, in fact, the figures. First, are we able to exploit the metals and the oil and gas which are in the ground in a country such as Greenland at a reasonable cost? Because, in fact, if you take Venezuela, for example, all the analysts and experts say that 25% of the oil reserves in the world should be or could be in Venezuela. But in what condition? What are, in fact, the amount of money we are going to spend to get the oil from the ground in Venezuela? In fact, a lot of money. So there are countries where, in fact, it's easier. Iran is one of them, for example. And Iran has got about 15% of the world gas reserves, which can be exploited very easily. So I agree with you on Iran and a few things in Latin America, but one of the main reasons for the Americans, and if we keep in mind again the example of the Monroe Doctrine and what happened at the time, the fact that the United States felt threatened by European powers and European countries, and by the way, again, they were attacked in 1812. Remember, it was during the Napoleonic era and the French army was in Russia. So in fact, the Brits were fighting on both sides. They were fighting the French and they were fighting the Americans. So, and that, in fact, was the reason of the Monroe Doctrine. And same story about Donald Trump. I've been in Latin America many times in the last 20 years with my colleagues in Argentina, in Chile, in Brazil, colleagues from these countries. And they all told me that the main threat, in fact, the stability of the area, was the power of the Chinese, which were buying, in fact, everything and turning these countries into, again, third world countries. I'm going to give you just one example. It's the ore industry and the fact that Brazil is one of the main producers in the world of iron. And in fact, they are selling it to the Chinese, but not transformed, in fact. The Chinese, just like the Europeans in the 19th century, are buying raw materials, not transformed at all, in Latin America. And they are doing the same thing. Things we did, by the way, ourselves in the past, in Africa, in Latin America, everywhere. We don't have the will or the power to do it. But if we had, I'm sure the Europeans would do it again. because in fact the history is always the same story. And so the Chinese just replaced the Europeans in Latin America. And so in fact what the Americans are doing in Latin America is just a continuity of what they've been doing in the 19th century against the Europeans. Back to Iran. I've been following Iran for many, many years. I worked on this country in the Ministry of Defense, in General Secretary of National Defense, in the Foreign Office, the French Foreign Office. I've never been there because I was not allowed to go to this country, unfortunately, because in fact I'm very interested in the Persian culture. And I think that because Persia and the Iranian culture is something which is at the top of the world culture for many reasons, it's really to have such a regime, which is in fact killing its children and everyone, and for so many years, it's not something we can accept on the long term. One of the main problems of this story is the fact that when we tried regime change in Iraq or in Afghanistan, it failed. And so that's the reason why in the last months with my former colleagues, but we are still connected, in Latin America or in Europe or in the US, I said we need a regime change, but it doesn't have to be in fact implemented or forced from the outside. And that's the main problem. Because the world would be much better with a democratic Iran. And so that's why I'm probably like you, I'm not in favor of any kind of military intervention. But to have such a dictatorship in the area is not good for anyone, and especially not for the Iranians themselves. They deserve better. And they have a rich country. They have about 10% of the well-known oil reserves, which can be exploited, with a reasonable amount of money. 15% of the gas reserves, some minerals, especially in the northeastern part of the country, close to Turkmenistan and Afghanistan. And in fact, they have a lot of people who are well-trained, engineers, doctors, So in fact, Iran should be South Korea, sorry, not North Korea, no. For God's sake, no, never. But it's not the case, not because of embargo. I don't believe in the story of embargo about Cuba, for example, because in fact, Cuba can trade with everyone in the world. They cannot do it with the United States because of the embargo, but they can trade. I've been to Cuba, they can trade with Canada. And Cuba has been full of tourists from Canada or Europe for the last 30 years. So this is just the story of the regime, which is a dictatorship. So the main problems, to finish.
Coming back to Europe,
yeah.
How to reduce this vulnerability regarding gas dependence and rare materials for Europe?
First, I don't think there is any Europe. If you look at the recent days, well, all right, it's an international organization, so what? And in fact, when I look at what my German colleagues, I like Germany, by the way, you know, my jacket and all these things, and it comes from Bavaria. And by the way, there is the map of Bavaria on it. But we must admit that we strongly disagree with our German colleagues on many topics, especially the industry, especially energy. And one of the, well, the one who was responsible, I think, for a huge part of what's happening in the European Union for the time being is Angela Merkel, in fact. Everything she decided was, in fact, against France or Germany or the European Union in the field of defense, energy, raw materials. In fact, she was, in my opinion, strongly anti-French. And France is now a weak country for many reasons. And it's not good at all, because when I look at what the Germans said to my own country a few days ago, it's something which would not have been accepted 10 years ago or 20 years ago, and certainly not by General de Gaulle or Georges Pompidou.
So what do you think could be the future? European Union maybe will reestablish...
To build our own aircraft without the Germans first. And because Rafale, in fact, is a very good plane, and in fact, we can do another one with Dassault. And because, in fact, they want to steal all the competencies of the French, by the way. And I think France has to be strong again, to pay the debt, to be strong again. And when France is strong again, maybe we can see about European policies.
Okay. And the last very short, because we should comment about Ukraine. How do you see the war in Ukraine in the context of rare earth minerals? And how do you see the end of this war? Can you comment on the negotiations in place in Geneva?
I don't know, because if we come back to what we said before, in fact, and that's what was said, it's again a problem of ego on both sides. And I would like the war to end, because in fact people are dying on the ground, and in fact rich people are in fact in Megève skiing. I had a fight with some Russians 2 weeks ago, in fact, in Megève, because they were not behaving well in the streets. And so I just reminded these people that they are in France and they are not welcome. Well, I don't know, because in fact everything is in the hands of Vladimir Putin. The last time I've been there, it was 22 years ago, in fact, and I saw his office. And I had a talk with the General Secretary of the Kremlin at the time, and he wanted me to see the office of Vladimir Putin. And on the desk, there was a photo, because as you know, the Russians are very often well informed, and they had certainly a lot of information on me, and they still have. And they knew that I studied Russian history and Russian civilization in Paris, and I was deeply interested in Russian culture. And he wanted to show me a photo on the desk of Vladimir Putin, which was the one of Pyotr Arkadyevich Stolypin, which was the prime minister of Nicholas II between 1906 and 1911. And he was the only one who tried to change Russia before the First World War and to implement deep economic reforms in the country, especially in rural areas, because he thought it was the only way to stabilize the country and to turn the autocracy to a form of Western democracy. So, when you look at the photo I saw on the desk 22 years ago in the Kremlin, and what happened in the last 22 years, it's a little bit different. The story is a little bit different. Because don't forget that Vladimir Putin is someone from the KGB, in fact. He was trained and he was, in fact, based in Eastern Germany. That's the reason why he could speak a very good German, because he's a very clever guy, and he's not crazy, as I sometimes read in the French press or in the European press, which is not true. But as many leaders, and when you stay a very long time in power, it's got a problem of ego. And the main problem of the Ukraine is in fact in the hands of Vladimir Putin, because he's the only one, in fact, to be able to solve the problem. It's not Donald Trump at all. Donald Trump can say everything he wants. If Vladimir doesn't want, nothing is going to change. So, I'm sorry, but I'm not a friend of Vladimir, and I cannot say exactly what he has in mind.
Alors, c'était juste deux commentaires un petit peu pour préciser, parce que le dernier apéro géopolitique portait sur le Groenland, justement. Donc c'était important de préciser, on avait eu une discussion ici, c'est que beaucoup de concessions minières, en fait, au Groenland ont échoué à cause des conditions d'exploitation. C'est ce que j'avais mentionné également dans une analyse que j'ai faite sur la question, qu'en fait, on a une vision qui est un peu exagéré sur la question des ressources sur le Groenland, et qu'en réalité, les éléments qui motivent cette volonté américaine, c'est, de mon point de vue, surtout le positionnement géostratégique et la question des routes du Nord. Parce que pour vouloir exploiter des terres rares dont on ne sait pas en réalité l'exactitude des réserves sous 1 kilomètre de glace, j'essaye simplement de vous laisser deviner la quantité d'énergie qu'il faudrait simplement pour y parvenir. Ce qui fait qu'en réalité, l'exploitation en est en grande partie impossible. C'est la première chose. Et deuxièmement, je voulais réagir par rapport à la question énergétique entre la France et l'Allemagne, parce que c'est quelque chose qui est extrêmement intéressant, extrêmement important. J'ai travaillé, il se trouve que j'ai travaillé dessus, sur la question de ce qu'on a appelé le partenariat énergétique franco-allemand, et la façon, en fait, à travers laquelle il y a eu une espèce de travail d'entrisme, de guerre économique, venu d'Allemagne pour détruire ou porter atteinte à ce qu'on a appelé l'industrie électronucléaire française, qui en était arrivée à une certaine période à être celle la plus performante au monde. Et, voilà. Et les façons qui ont été utilisées, un petit peu en quelques mots, sont assez étonnantes, parce qu'on a eu une lecture qui était une lecture allemande, qui s'inscrivait dans une logique de guerre économique, c'est-à-dire pour empêcher en réalité la montée en puissance ou pour affaiblir l'effort industriel français, il fallait à la fois casser l'accès de l'industrie française à une énergie pas chère, qui lui était permise par le nucléaire, et en même temps il fallait trouver les justifications pour l'Allemagne de pouvoir importer du gaz naturel pas cher de Russie et ainsi avoir un avantage comparatif par rapport à la fois au modèle industriel français et italien qui étaient les concurrents directs de l'industrie allemande. Ça c'était une chose, mais ce que j'ai pu découvrir qui était très intéressant, c'est qu'à l'intérieur même du débat germanico-allemand ou alémano-allemand, en réalité il y avait le jeu d'un certain nombre de Länder, notamment de Länder qui souhaitaient développer la filière dite des énergies vertes, dites renouvelables, en réalité énergie intermittente, et qu'il leur fallait en fait des subventions de l'État fédéral allemand, sans quoi ces énergies ne pouvaient pas être investies. Et donc il fallait arriver à ce que des décisions soient prises à l'échelle européenne pour qu'on crée en fait une sorte de marché énergétique européen où le coût, un coût minimum soit assuré sur la base de la production d'énergie la plus onéreuse en Europe, donc qui faisait que quoi que vous produisiez, vous arriviez toujours à retomber sur vos pattes. Et c'est comme ça en réalité que l'une des raisons de la désindustrialisation française peut s'expliquer à travers une guerre économique en fait qui n'a pas dit son nom ouvertement. Voilà. Voilà. Merci.
Merci. Hichem.
Voilà.
I think next time we will need some German expert.
On Europe, don't forget the big picture. It is a multipolar world. The big competition is US versus China. Russia doesn't look today as though it's in the middle, but it is in the middle. And Donald Trump's policy is to bring Russia as far as he can away from China and towards the United States. And in this big, very Kissingerian, isn't it? Well, yes, it is very Kissingerian. It's the opposite of what Kissinger did in the 60s and the 70s. It's to break Russia away from China as much as possible and put it in a position to do business with the West. Now, where does Europe come in all of this? Well, Europe is along for the ride. Europe's in the back, along for the ride. Europe is not going to become a superpower. Take my word for it. It's impossible. It won't happen. Europe will be an appendage to the West, led by Washington. And Europe would be very well advised to start right away talking to the Russians. And here's something that I'll make a prediction and hold me to it when we meet again in 10 years. I think after the Ukraine war is put aside, on Russian terms, Donald Trump will go to fairly great lengths to encourage the Europeans to plug again into Russian energy production. He will encourage the Europeans to buy Russian fossil fuels, despite the fact that, yeah, America's doing pretty good business right now with liquefied natural gas. But it is in the geopolitical interest of the United States to do a big favor to Russia in order to bring Russia closer to the United States in its competition with China, to give Russia some options so that it won't have to rely entirely on China. And so I think you'll find, Donald Trump will be trying to rebuild those pipelines, which his predecessor had something to do with blowing up just a few years ago. Mark my words.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear experts. Thank you very much, dear audience, for your attention, for your interest. Thank you, our team of Apéro Géopolitique, Branson, Shem, Tatiana, and our team members who couldn't be today with us. And now, thank you, students of SUSUMEF, who helped us a lot today. Now we would like to invite you to Apéro. It's wine provided by Ion Gerciu, a Swiss winemaker. So please welcome to Apéro networking session. Thank you very much.